Our Society's leader, Bart Worden, will be speaking today. Bart has been the Executive Director of the American Ethical Union, the National Federation of Ethical Culture and Ethical Humanist Societies since June of 2012. Bart is, in addition, a social worker who has worked with programs that help people recover from psychiatric disability. His theme for this year is Living Positively, an essential element of ethical humanism. Bart's address today is titled Listening for Deep Stories. Please welcome Bart to the podium.
Thank you all. Another cool thing about this podium is it also goes higher, which, given my particular visual interests, or capacities rather. Sorry, let me just pop this in. Okay. Yeah, so this year my address cycle is on the notion of living positively and figuring out ways that we can engage with people around complex and often difficult problems in line with the values and ideals of ethical humanism. And this is something I've been talking about not just at this society, but I visit other societies as well. And one of the things I've been finding is that there is a lot of concern that people are expressing and frustration with the state of discourse today, especially discourse going across the aisle, if you will, on the political spectrum, with people feeling a strong anger about things that have been happening in recent days, and oftentimes almost a level of contempt for people who are expressing views that seem just so horrific that it's hard to imagine that people would hold them. You know, so I'm sure this is a familiar kind of quality that people are having. If you watch the news at all, you can see the liveliness that goes there. Thing is, to my mind, that's a real problem that goes beyond the philosophical or thought problem. It's a problem of how we are together in terms of our actions and our capacity to be together. And if we are not successful, to my mind, in finding more ways to work cooperatively with people, even people who have different points of view than our own, we don't stand a very good chance, to my mind, of really moving our world, our culture, forward in a way that's sustainable and helpful, right? I mean, we have so many significant issues before us. If we're constantly fighting each other rather than working together to solve those problems, you can't expect that we're going to make the kind of headway we'd like to see. And in the meantime, things that are not going well continue to go, if anything, that much worse, right? So I'm constantly looking for ways, how can we do better here? And recently on, On Being, I guess is a radio show with Krista Tippett, she interviewed a sociologist named Arlie Hochschild. And Hochschild has done a yeoman's job of trying to unpack what she calls the sociology of emotion. Because what she was finding is that people have all these different ideas about things that they pursue that don't seem to match up well with the facts of their existence. In other words, when people vote, when people make decisions, a lot of times, if you look objectively at their world, you just can't feel anything but puzzled about the decisions that they've made. So case in point, she spent a lot of time in Louisiana. Louisiana is the second poorest state in the United States and probably has the worst environmental conditions in the United States. Why is that? Well, the oil industry has especially taken hold there, and so between the drilling in the Gulf and then pumping stuff back into the refineries in that part of the world, or the fracking or other kind of ways of extracting stuff for fossil fuels, they have just basically decimated the bayous and the landscape. So the water's polluted, the air's polluted, cancer rates are skyrocketing. And yet it's a state that is reliably voting for people who would like to see the Environmental Protection Agency done away with, and voting for people who would like to see government stop taxing people, all kinds of things like this. And you think, for folks that are on the receiving end of this level of problem, they would think, well, this is a time for our government to be stepping in a helpful kind of way. And yet that is not the direction people take. And so Hochschild was very interested in what is behind people's actual decisions. And she came up with a couple ideas that she talks about in her book. The book, by the way, is Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. And she spent several years, I believe, in Louisiana putting this book together. So one thing that she talks about is there being an empathy wall. In other words, what tends to separate people, especially, she's somebody who grew up in a liberal family and was teaching at Berkeley, so this is somebody who has strong liberal roots. I think her parents were Unitarians. And so she has very much the liberal credential, like a democratic socialist kind of credential, if you will. And yet where she was going is to find people who really were very much on the strong conservative end. Tea Party folks in particular was her group that she was looking to talk to. And she said that what she noticed is there was a real empathy wall here, that there seemed to be a way that people experience life that was just so different that it made it almost like a barrier between her and other people. And she describes that it was, let's see. So here's her definition. It's an empathy wall is an obstacle to deep understanding of another person, one that can make us feel indifferent or even hostile to those who hold different beliefs or whose childhood is rooted in different circumstances. In a period of political tumult, we grasp for quick certainties. We shoehorn new information into ways we already think. We settle for knowing our opposite numbers from the outside. But is it possible, without changing our beliefs, to know others from the inside? To see reality through their eyes, to understand the links between life, feeling, and politics? That is what she means by crossing the empathy wall, being able to understand people from the inside. Because quite frankly, where do we get our notions about people in Louisiana who are voting for, people that we wouldn't vote for ourselves? Probably getting it from the news, right? We're not getting it from the people themselves, right? So one of the strong pieces for Hochschild is she went there and was talking to people. And what she was finding is that the people there were very engaging, they were very friendly, they helped each other out, they had lots of strong ideas about what it meant to be good people, and they were aware of how decimated their environment was as well. And in fact, some of them actually had suits against the corporations that had been polluting the area. Some of them had actually participated in doing the pollution, so they knew exactly what had happened. And yet, they were still voting for the conservative Tea Party candidates, right? They were putting signs out for them, et cetera. What a puzzle was this? Well, what she was finding is that people had what she would call a deep story that would drive their attitudes and their decisions. And a deep story is kind of that personal narrative that you have that helps explain to yourself who you are and why you are that person. A deep narrative. We all have them, right? That's the questions to ponder were aimed at getting a start to your own deep narrative. What is it that gets you thinking in a political spectrum, for instance? What gets you thinking about what is important and how you would make a decision based on that front? So what she was finding for these folks in Louisiana that she was interviewing, what was important to them was their Catholicism and their sense of being right with God. Many of these folks actually were very much into the notion of Revelations and the second coming. And so when they looked at the decimation around them, they thought, well, here's a sign, so I better get ready. right? So, so that's one piece of it. There's another piece about really being annoyed about government intervention, period. Right? The idea that the government would in any way hamper things that they want to do was just felt very objectionable. So even if they're trying to do something helpful, they didn't like it. And in fact, when the government did do helpful things, often that would backfire in terms of people's sense of appreciation for what had happened, right? So there's this sense that government should stay out because people should be relying upon each other to solve their problems, right? And they do that. These are folks that have lived in this area for hundreds of years, and they have managed to be in communities where they helped each other and they managed through the course of time. Now, a thing about our stories is they have a lot of blind spots. Right? So obviously this story has some blind spots, so let's think about the people that are saying how well they were doing and how they were able to rely on each other. Were all white. Right? And when you start talking to people on the other side of the color spectrum, they had a very different point of view about how well things are going before the oil companies came in to work as well. And you can still see that those things are still quite stark in terms of how people are treated and what the expectations are for folks. And in fact, that does factor into one of the other pieces, which is people don't like the idea of giving something to someone who doesn't deserve it. Right, so this is a powerful piece for people. The irony, of course, to this is Louisiana is a state, 44% of its budget is from the government. 44%. And in fact, the very folks that are voting for Tea Party aren't against getting Medicaid or doing other kind of things, but they find a way to kind of shift their thinking around that to kind of make it the government's fault that they're giving that money, and if it's there, there'd be no reason to not take it, et cetera, et cetera. So, now, this all may be sounding like, well, those stupid people and all that kind of thing. But the real point here is we all have our deep stories. And our deep stories have blind spots too. So one of the helpful things for us about learning other people's stories is the opportunity to see how a story works and doesn't, and to be able to reflect back on our own and to imagine how that is impacting our choices, our values, and things that we're looking to do. Because let's face it, we live in a segregated world here, right? How many of us are living in communities that have a range of people from different backgrounds in their area? Not many, some, but not many of us. Right? How many of us have looked to make sure our kids went to a good school system, right? And what does a good school system generally mean? Oftentimes it means it's wealthy people, because the wealthy districts are places that can put together a good staff, and they know that the kids will go to good colleges, all those kind of things, right? But those are part of our stories about our expectations and what we expect to see. And they keep us, I think, from seeing some of the things that we would do well to see. I mean, how many of us are petitioning our town councils to have more affordable housing and to have higher density housing in our neighborhoods, right? How many of us are pushing, to have make sure there's stronger police accountabilities and civilian oversight of the police activity in our own towns, right? There's 42 municipalities, 40 police departments. How many of us are able to do that, right? Well, the thing is, quite frankly, we probably don't feel a strong need to do that because our lives are not so terribly affected, we think, by those factors. Anyway, so in kind of reading Hochschild's book and wanting to do my own explorations, I thought probably the best bet is for me to find someone that I can talk to locally who I know in person, who can kind of talk about a different point of view. So I did contact an acquaintance of mine. This is the father of one of my younger son's good friends. And I happen to know from my son that the entire family voted for, didn't vote for Hillary, let's put it that way. And that, in fact, they were still supporters of the current administration. So I thought, well, that's very interesting. I'm really surprised to hear Ossining. Anyway, so I called up, and he agreed to have a sit down with me. We went to a diner and had a nice chat. I'm going to call him Will. That's not his name. But he actually asked that I not identify him by name, and not because he's embarrassed about what his thoughts are, but because he wouldn't have a chance to review what I'm going to say to you right now before going out over the airwaves. So I really can respect that. So I'll call him Will, and I'll share the address with him afterwards, and we'll see if we have another meeting and that sort of thing. But in the meantime, so he is somebody that I know because of my own NIMBY activity. Years ago, my next door neighbor there's an empty lot next to us. It used to be a rather infamous bar called the Oasis. And do you remember the Oasis? At one time, it was a very nice little bed and breakfasty kind of inn kind of place, but it deteriorated over the course of time, and so this became the Townie Bar in the Townie section of the town of Ossining. So I live in Crotonville, which is right the edge, and it was an area that has been kind of rough and tumble. You know, people often would say, oh, I wouldn't go up there, you know, because there's people that are wild and crazy. And in fact, I remember looking out my door, and there was a delicatessen next to me one day, and I saw a circle of men in the street, and there are two people in the middle, bare knuckle fist fighting, and the rest of them cheering them on. You know, so this is like, okay, this is an interesting neighborhood. Anyway, so the Oasis was a bar that was popular with people that drank to excess and would be found peeing and throwing up on people's lawns and things like that. So the neighborhood was very happy when somebody torched the place. When I moved in, I only knew the history because all there was a foundation. But the owner, some years later, decided he wanted to do something with this property. And so he came up with this plan. And the plan was to build, it's zoned neighborhood commercial. And his idea was to put offices for his rebar business. He does iron rebar for concrete stuff. And while he was at it, put a warehouse in there for rebar. Now, I'm upon us in the narrow street with double yellow lines. You know, we're thinking, wait a minute, this trucks will be coming in, and we have no sidewalks already, et cetera, et cetera. And so we went to the town meeting when we heard that this was going to be talked about by the zoning guys. And we were very concerned about it. My wife happened to mention it to a friend who said, well, my husband, Will, knows a lot about this. I'll tell him to show up at the meeting, and he will help you out. And he did. So what did Will do before he arrived at this meeting? Well, he worked for McDonald's. And what was his job for McDonald's? Well, McDonald's always had trouble getting their businesses in the right places, right? They did extensive research, demographic research, to indicate where's a good place for a McDonald's to be and how can we get a franchise going here. But there'd be community resistance because there'd be businesses in there that said, you know, we have our own little shops here. We don't want McDonald's in our neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. So his job was to convince the town boards that they should go forward with McDonald's and get the zoning. So he knew his zoning stuff. The guy's in real estate. So he comes to the Ossining meeting, and he stands up and he starts asking these pointed questions to the zoning board, and everything stopped. And they thought that we'd hired a lawyer. And so things stopped, and they said, well, I think we'll have to consider this more. And so afterwards, he gave me some instructions on where to find the zoning regulations and some ideas about the kind of things that I might want to speak to in terms of my concerns there. And so I wrote this piece, and then he reviewed it and helped shore it up a little bit. And it was kick-ass, I got to tell you. I got the word later that on the basis of this letter, the head of the zoning board went over to a place where there's a business kind of like the one this guy wanted to put in, and looked at it and said, I tried to look at it from the vantage point of your front porch. And that made all the difference. They deep sixed it. They wouldn't let him go forward. Now the thing is, well, okay, you can call that kind of a win, but it is a bit of an embarrassing win, isn't it? Quite frankly, what I would like to see there is high-density housing. And another business, I can say, well, there was environmental impact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But quite frankly, that's the same kind of argument that people are making all the time whenever you try to put in affordable housing. All right, so I really have to own that it wasn't exactly pure motives that had me rolling against this particular issue. And it was my entree to this individual, to Will. Thing is, I found Will to be a very kind, thoughtful, considerate person. Over the course of years, I've had many, many interactions with him. And so I was really quite surprised to hear that he was a voter for the current administration. So we were having this conversation about it, and we started sharing kind of how we got to the places we did. And his story was this. He says, even as a young kid, I knew that I wanted to be successful with my career. So I set my goal, even as a child, to finish school, to go to college, to get a degree, and to get into a business where I knew I could make money and do that reliably. And that's what I did. And so my politics really flows from this decision, right? Because I think that I benefited from the fact that there weren't that many controls that I had to deal with, that I was able to pay my way through school, that I was able to put up, do the kind of business that I do without too many regulations making my life miserable for the longest while, but that changed, and so that got him kind of unhappy. And that he managed to build a life for himself and for his family that he was pleased about. And so his story is one where he can notice his life in relation to what he wants and to say, okay, we're doing not too bad here. Right? My guess is that's probably something that we're all kind of doing, right? When we look at our lives, we're probably not wildly dissatisfied with them, right? And we probably can think about how we live within a range of what we would expect of ourselves. Right? We don't do too many things that are wildly, exceptionally excellent and wonderful, and we don't do too many things that are wildly and exceptional, illegal, and troubling either. Right? We live kind of in this band that's a little bit more comfortable, and in fact, for the most part, we're probably kind, considerate, thoughtful people to the people that we come across in our lives. Right? I think I'm right with that. Okay. All right. But what happens then when you wind up in a situation where you have significant challenges to that? So in our conversations, he was talking about how he really felt that you need to have an even a level playing field, and so you shouldn't have a lot of regulations. People should really be just encouraged to, make a good life for themselves. So I brought up this notion that, one of the worries I have is, when you take regulations off at a time when there isn't a fair shake for people at that time, basically what you've done then is make it possible for those people who have a leg up to hold on to that leg up, and for those people who were struggling to continue to struggle, right? Because in truth, they really don't have the same opportunities, even if you can say theoretically the opportunities are there. In reality, they just don't. Right? They didn't have the opportunity of their parents buying real estate years ago and making that an investment and then putting money into the stock market and generating that stuff and then letting you inherit it without any taxes on it, and then you can kind of build that up for your own kids, etc. It's a very different scene when you come up into a place where there's already debt, right? Where there's no opportunity for actually buying anything. You get the picture, all right? So when I brought that up to Will, he said, well, it's funny you should mention that, because when I was working for McDonald's, his boss had him have a meeting with a franchise owner who was black, who was very successful with his franchise, also had a lot to say about social justice issues relating to racism and structural racism. And so Will sat down with him, and they had this long conversation. And he says his eyes were really opened. He really heard what this person had to say. The intriguing thing was that didn't translate into a sense that he needed to do something about it. Right? In other words, ultimately, he could still say, but, it really isn't my problem. The thing to look out for is when we do say that to ourselves, that it's not our problem, or when we behave in such a way that we consider it not our problem, what people struggle for. Right. So, back to Louisiana, there's incredible decimation there. And the decimation is coming because our stories, I think, are built for us in a different time and at a different level of community organization. Right? Our deep stories are built around our families, our communities, our neighbors, maybe a few a little bit more extended. They do not equip us to deal with corporate power. They do not equip us to deal with corporate power. And it's corporate power that is decimating Louisiana, not the personal stories. These companies knowingly go to places where they know people have few options and are least likely to put up a fight. And they do that knowingly because that's where they'll have the best opportunity to do things without regulation, to kind of let things even destroy the environment without repercussions for them as a business. The thing is, for those of us who have investments, we're on the receiving end of that profit. We're on the receiving end of that profit. So if you look over the places where there's the most decimation, oddly enough, those are the places that are most likely to be Tea Party voters. And when you look at the places that have the least decimation, those tend to be the very blue areas of the country. Right? Well, we're living in a bit of a fantasy in that regard. And that's not to say, by the way, that what we should do is go down to Louisiana and, I don't know, rabble-rouse or something like that. I don't know if that would be thought well of. But I don't know that we can also let stand this notion that these businesses and corporations are ruining communities and killing people. We really can't be standing for that in a way that I can sleep with, I hope. So where does this all lead us? Okay, so look, the real truth of the matter is our lives are ones where we can, in fact, connect with each other. And at least we can connect with the people that we do know and like, right? So we should go ahead and keep continuing that. I'd like to put in the extra idea that some of those folks that would vote very differently from you might also be people that could be your friends, that could be people that you could respect and care about in some way, shape, or form. But it takes a stepping aside from your story enough that you can hear other aspects of who they are, how they roll, what they're trying to do, what they care about, so that you can be connected, so that you can climb over that empathy wall enough to at least shake hands. So I'd like to close. So you have to wonder where it leads us. Well, hopefully we can all find ways to explore our own deep stories and gain a better appreciation for how our stories affect our values. And it also affect our choices and our actions. And perhaps we can come to appreciate different stories, or at least increase our understanding of their impact upon the hearts and minds of others, whose stories seem so different from our own. In the end, if we are seekers and good listeners, we stand a chance of scaling the walls that divide us from other people. And if we can do that, there just may be a chance for bridging the divide so that we can together work toward a more common good.